Fake frames have long had a major downside other than potential image quality, and that is latency. In our testing today, we're revisiting Lossless Scaling Frame Generation, but for latency, using this physical hardware tester this time. Last time, we ran an image quality comparison for upscaling and frame generation using Lossless Scaling Frame Generation, going frame by fake frame to analyze the output. In some instances, like Space Marine at 2x, it worked just fine. In others, like using the comically high 20x to get 800 FPS, and what we assume will be NVIDIA's next DLSS stage demo, it wasn't playable. But we liked the $7 Steam tool overall, and pointed out a ton of its use cases last time, like potential use in emulators, pixel art games, or even non-gaming applications. Our latency benchmarks today look at multi-GPU scaling when offloading the work to an older secondary card, both with and without a frame rate cap. The testing includes scaling at 2x, 4x, and even some tests at 10x and 20x. This resulted in us creating a new metric called 5% highs for latency to better highlight the worst results that are still relatively common. All of this is because latency is underrepresented in testing, even in ours. I mean, as opposed to something like FPS, which is a simple metric. But arguably, latency is the closest thing to what the player actually feels when they're playing the game. And so that's what we're going to be looking at when frame generation isn't mismarketed or used to deceive an audience.
RTX 5070, 4090 performance at 549.
It can actually be a useful tool in specific use cases as long as reality is kept in frame and it's not abused to just try and sell more GPUs. And LSFG does a better job of this, we think, than the companies selling the GPUs, because they're selling GPUs. The limiter is often latency, which we're testing with this open source latency tester from TechteamGB. We've worked with him in the past on an ancient MSI video now. This latency tester uses an Arduino solution with a silicon photodiode to measure display light levels, allowing us to pull precise latency metrics without using tools from NVIDIA or Intel, which are the two alternatives that are most commonly known right now. We don't have competitive testing today for latency with LSFG versus NVIDIA DLSS Frame Gen, AMD, AFMF, or Intel XeSS FG, but eventually we'll have an answer to the question of who will win. One $5 trillion company hell-bent on capturing the entire economy, or a pixelated yellow duck. But he might get a pixelated leather jacket.
Do you like my jacket?
Let's get into the benchmarks. Before that, this video is brought to you by the Montech HSO1 and HSO2 cases. The HSO1 and HSO2 cases differ by way of a mesh front or a curved glass front. We previously reviewed these cases in our intensive benchmarking process and found them to be overall high build quality, with thermals comparable between the two designs. The rear chamber of the case uniquely brings the power supply forward and perforates the rear wall of the case, allowing for more air movement internally while providing a different look. The rear of the case uses a fan mounting mechanism for two separate fans that can be coupled together with a plate, improving convenience. The HSO1 and HSO2 also invert with minimal effort, allowing the computer to present to the opposite side without needing to reconfigure the entire build. Learn more at the links in the description below. So last time we looked at the wildly popular LSFG for image quality, mostly looking at LS1 upscaling and also frame by fake frame generation for the just actual composition of the frames as they're generated at different rates, 2, 4, 20x, and so forth. And then LS1 was just more of a simpler upscaling thing. That was completely without any other considerations, no latency, no performance. Today, that's what we're looking at, and lossless scaling can apply its LSFG algorithm effectively to any game or desktop application, and it's compatible with the vast majority of modern GPUs. It can also do dual GPU, which is really cool, and we talked about it last time, but we didn't really get into testing. As for latency today, it's a major experiential factor playing a game, and it's always been difficult for end users to quantify, often coming down to trying to describe just generally how it feels. Latency is one piece of the game playing experience. You have throughput, there's consistency, and then there's latency. Throughput is represented by frames per second, or frame rate, and often shown as bar charts. FPS is usually the main factor in our perception of sort of smooth motion, and it's the most widely understood performance metric. Now there's some caveats here where we get into animation error, but that's a separate video we've already done. Consistency can be broadly defined as any deviation away from the evenly timed delivery of frames to the screen, like frame pacing. Poor consistency is perceived as stuttering or hitching. Animation error is a closely related concept. See our, again, white paper for details on that. We'll link it below. And then the FPS 1% low and 0.1% low numbers on our game charts function as a means to tell us to look into the consistency of the frame-to-frame interval. Basically, if we see a bad 1% and 1% number, we pull up a line chart. What we're not talking about today is specifically the input lag or input latency. These are sort of subparts of the total end-to-end system latency or the click-to-photon latency, where a lot of times when people talk about the end-to-end system latency, click-to-photon, they'll use the word input lag or input latency. That's a different thing if we want to get really specific about it. So we're not talking about those would be more reserved for something like a mouse. The form of latency we're looking at today is click-to-photon, which is how long it takes for the action, which is normally clicking, to become visible on the screen or displayed. That's measured in milliseconds, counting the peripherals in the pipeline. Bad latency is perceived as delay or the game just kind of feeling slow and unresponsive regardless of FPS. Our engineering interview with NVIDIA's Guillermo Simon does a great job of explaining the concepts related to latency and testing it in more detail. So here's a clip from that previously.
Yeah, so all of this is end-to-end system latency. So my sense is that when people think of the classical input lag, it's accounting for, they're trying to describe a phenomenon that manifests in the entire end-to-end system latency, but that's just a single piece of what contributes to the latency itself.
Now, this remains one of our favorite engineering interviews we've done, so it's worth checking out the video if you want to learn more about it. He did a great job explaining it. We'll quickly step through the pipeline of frame latency from that interview video, though. The instant the user clicks or moves the mouse, that input is processed by the mouse's hardware. It's electrically sent over USB, and then the PC processes the input signal. After that, the game engine samples the input, simulates the game state, and submits the frame data to be rendered to the graphics driver. Then, the driver interprets the frame data and adds it to the render queue. The GPU then renders the frame, briefly holding it for composition with any other screen elements by the OS, or DWM for Windows 11. Then the frame is scanned out to the display, which does its own processing. Finally, the display panel takes time to physically change color. Basic latency, or PC latency, is the portion that's entirely within the computer. It can be measured with software and is what the NVIDIA statistics overlay shows with its latency number presented. For this testing, we measured full end-to-end latency, which requires an external device to detect or generate the input, physically monitor the screen for change, and precisely time the delay. Now, FrameGen throws a wrench into all of this testing for some very specific reasons. Generated frames are purely visual, and they don't represent a real time step within the game engine. Because of that, generated frames cannot independently show user input except as an artifact of the transition between the two frames. Current frame generation methods rely on holding the newest completely finished frame for a relatively extended period in order to run the interpolation operation. Interpolation operation, by the way, the name of my first NVIDIA Jensen Huang diss track. You could have already been shown that fresh frame, but instead you have to wait for the generated frames to be created and shown first. Now the frame is a little bit stale. The added time to interpolate the fake frames is actually why turning FrameGen on for a GPU that's already fully loaded reduces the base frame rate. It's that overhead, and the GPU has slightly less time as a result to spend on drawing the real frames. Physical hardware is the most accurate for latency testing. Our methodology for this piece is very similar to our previous latency testing. We used a dedicated external device to precisely measure the time between sending an input, which the device sent, to the test bench PC until seeing the result of that input on the monitor. We are not using PresentMon's MS all input to photon latency metric, but instead using physical hardware. The most common latency measurement device is NVIDIA's LDAT among the reviewer community, and we've used it before. It works pretty well, including on handhelds. To further decouple from GPU vendors with potential conflicts, and also to just support an open source project that we think is really cool and that you all can buy yourselves if you want to do your own validation. NVIDIA LDAT, you can't get it. I mean, unless you're going to build a review outlet, it's kind of off limits. The thing we're using, anyone can buy, so it is an open sourced testing solution developed by TechteamGB. We have no direct affiliation with it. We did do some coverage with TechteamGB probably in 2018 or something. It's been a while, but it's a really cool utility. The latency tester and its software have various test modes, triggers, and automatic data processing. In our testing today, we used the games mode with automatic triggering set to 100 cycles of instantaneous mouse move input rather than clicks. Internally, the latency tester is an Arduino microcontroller with custom firmware and a custom PCB with a silicon photodiode that measures the display's light levels with extreme granularity. The tool is also very fast. As of firmware version 2.0, it takes a sample roughly every 15.25 microseconds. We tested using the NVIDIA RTX 5060 Ti on our 9800X3D GPU test bench. We used the same LSFG settings throughout testing. LSFG 3.1 with a fixed multiplier, flow scale at 100%, WGC capture mode with Q target 1, VSync off, max frame latency of 1, no HDR or G-Sync support, and multi-display mode on were the primary configuration settings. We tested in 4 games with a minimum of 16 configurations. It's kind of a lot to test for just 4 games. This is because we wanted to test a few different options in LSFG. So we tested with the different multipliers, 2, 4, sometimes 3 and 5x, sometimes 10 and 20x. We also tested using the out-of-the-box performance, so to speak, so that would just be without any frame generation turned on to give us a baseline. We further did testing with additional GPUs. So this meant sometimes an RTX 2060, 3060, or GTX 1060, 6GB. Then we also tested the 4 games again with an in-game FPS cap of 60 frames per second to represent Lossless Scaling's developers' guidelines directly, which suggest to not allow the GPU to run at full utilization. The idea is to avoid forcing the GPU to juggle both the games and LSFG's workloads, which can appear as poor performance, like stuttering. The results today are focused on relative scaling more than absolute values, and we also didn't enable any latency reducing features where present. So that means no NVIDIA reflex or AMD anti-lag or Intel XeLL, nothing like that. We're gonna use Cyberpunk 2077 for a deeper dive up front, and then we'll cover datasets from Marvel Rivals, from Rainbow Six Siege, and from Warhammer 40K Space Marine 2. Now, Rainbow Six Siege and Marvel Rivals are more latency sensitive than these other 2 games, and that's the reason we've chosen them the way we did. So we have at least one kind of 2 games that a competitive player would really care about the latency, and we have 2 games where you might be able to just kind of ignore some added latency. So that's all the test setup. Let's get into the benchmarks. In Cyberpunk 2077, this handrail served as a great spot for the tester to flip between the unlit section on the left and the blazingly bright pink section on the right. We ran the game at the low graphics preset to minimize the latency floor. We'll start with the uncapped FPS tests. Lower is better for total latency. Remember that frame rate change is correlated with latency change as well. Frame rate, including generated frames, is shown in the brackets next to the entry. The baseline total latency average for Cyberpunk 2077 without frame gen was 25.3 milliseconds. No frame gen versus LSFG at 2x is inherently the largest jump due to it going from the normal pipeline to the added delay of LSFG holding back the newest frame before it's displayed. This increased latency to 44.8 milliseconds. That's a huge 77% increase in exchange for a 39% increase in, I guess, FPS with the fake frames counted, and that puts a sharp first point on one of the costs of LSFG and potentially frame generation in general. Setting LSFG to 3x barely moved average total latency, adding only 3.5 milliseconds over 100 test passes. 4x and 5x show a 53.9 millisecond and 60.9 millisecond result. 60.9 milliseconds is 141% higher latency than without LSFG. However, image quality also needs to be considered and is something we talked about in the first piece. Adding extra interpolated frames on top of the initial ones doesn't cost much GPU time. It's just that initial hurdle that costs a lot. Just for fun and not because we recommend it, 10x adds 42% more latency over 5x, and 20x pushes all the way up to 139 milliseconds average, or 451% increase on baseline 25.3 milliseconds. The frame rate, if we can call it that, is 808 FPS average, something Jensen Huang would be proud of, although it's a blurry mess and it's something we, again, only did for fun. 139 milliseconds is similar to the original game streaming platforms back in the day and is getting into unplayable territory. Anyone can notice that. But we still like that the LSFG developers give the freedom to enable stuff that may seem useless just because because you never know what it'll be useful for. And like we said in the original piece, it's not like they're going around bragging that you can run games at 800 FPS now or something like you would see on stage for one of the major silicon makers. This chart shows latency results with Cyberpunk's native FPS capped at 60. Running without LSFG enabled resulted in 34.3 milliseconds of end-to-end latency, up from 25.3 when uncapped. Turning on LSFG at 2x increased latency by 28%, adding 10 milliseconds on average. Capping frame rate is helping mitigate the impact, though you also lose the benefit of latency reduction at baseline by nature of fewer frames displaying than originally. Just like in the uncapped chart, enabling FG at all creates the largest jump. From there, the percent increase to latency per multiplier increase went down. Latency increased by 18% from 2x to 3x, 7% from 3x to 4x, and then stepping all the way to 10x from 4x added only 10% more latency, bringing it to 60.9 milliseconds. So long as the GPU can keep up, the latency increase per extra multiplier is minimal. This chart adds a second GPU, which is a unique feature of LSFG that we appreciate. This leaves the primary GPU to focus on rendering the game and allows you to use an older card and a secondary slot to help with LSFG itself. This is something we talked about more in the first installment of this series. We tested an RTX 3060, RTX 2060 KO, and GTX 1060 6GB to examine scaling and decide which to use for other tests. The short version is that the thinking is someone on a 5060 Ti might have one of these three older cards in particular, and so we wanted to use the oldest viable card in these series of choices. Baseline average total latency without LSFG and with the 3060 operating as functionally a useless pass-through device added 3.4 milliseconds over the single GPU stock config. Running LSFG 2x on the secondary 3060 raised the average total latency by 31%, hitting 37.5 milliseconds. The test with 2x LSFG without a secondary card had a lower 267 FPS average frame rate and a higher latency, putting it at 44.8 milliseconds when using data from the prior test. The secondary 3060 is a major improvement on the 2x LSFG test without a secondary device, and increasing the multiplier to 4x added 7.6 milliseconds on top of 2x with a 3060, landing at 45.1 milliseconds total average latency. 4x without a secondary card had it at 53.9 milliseconds and at a lower frame rate. So again, the secondary device is a significant improvement. The 90 FPS change is about an 11 millisecond difference if both snapshots of that frame rate are taken at the same instance, so these differences align. The average frame rate isn't instantaneous, of course, but an average over the run, so we expect the deviation that we're seeing here between them. The RTX 2060 KO at 4x averaged 63 milliseconds of latency, 40% higher than with the 3060 in the secondary slot. Using the GTX 1060 instead made for 95.6 milliseconds of latency, which is obviously significantly worse. You'd be better off running it without the secondary GPU if the 1060 is the only option in this scenario. So there is a limit to how useful an older GPU is. These weaker GPUs have a harder time coping with the workload in this uncapped scenario. Lower base frame rate would lead to less added latency, so we'll look at that next. Putting the 60 FPS cap in place shows that the LSFG configs are still significantly higher latency than the basic single card is without FrameGen, which was at 34.3 milliseconds. The 4x LSFG results are tied between the 2060, 1060, and 3060, all three within 54 to 56 milliseconds average latency. That means that the ceiling is higher for how much base frame rate the 2060 and 1060 can keep up with when at 1080p. If you're using an older device and finding that it's actually making latency substantially worse in some situations, consider frame rate capping the game to free up some headroom. Next is Rainbow Six Siege, a game that can run at comically high frame rates already on its own, given a powerful enough GPU. This is a good example of a latency-sensitive game where you might want to avoid frame generation strictly for purposes of maintaining better latency, which is why we added it. This is one of those scenarios where any extra latency is more likely to be noticeable. We added an average of the highest 5% of individual latency test cycles, which we're calling 5% highs. We'll consider running more cycles next time so we can tune it lower than 5%. The baseline total average was incredibly fast at 9.9 milliseconds. We're actually a little shocked that Ubisoft can do something this well. LSFG at 2x multiplier increased latency by 11.6 milliseconds to reach 21.4, or a 116% increase. Dealing with such a low starting value begins to make percentage scaling math feel less intuitive than just stating the absolute, So for example, the 20x LSFG results at 922.1 FPS, because you can't leave off the 0.1, and its 82.8 milliseconds of latency is 736.9% higher than baseline. Anyway, 4x LSFG averaged to 29.4 milliseconds of total latency. That's still fast in general terms, but highly competitive games like Siege are where the milliseconds matter the most. That renders the rest of the results following this one inadvisable for actual use. The time cost of cranking out hundreds of interpolated frames every second adds up. The worst was 20x with the RTX 3060 as a secondary card, which reached 93 milliseconds of latency. This is also the configuration that caused us to show the 5% highs, which came to 170.7 milliseconds. The raw demand and having to transfer all the input frames across the PCIe bus clearly put the 3060 up against a wall. In an affront to whomever the deity of esports is, the fatality, I guess, this chart shows Siege with a 60 FPS cap. The overall ramp of latency is far less pronounced than without a cap. 2x LSFG added 7.6 milliseconds of latency over baseline, and 4x only 2.7 milliseconds on top of that. The latency jump when running the dual GPU setup was subtle, each a few milliseconds more than just the 5060 Ti on its own at both 2x and 4x. Running 20x frame gen did 20x frame gen things, coming in at 168% higher than baseline at 82.8 milliseconds, which is slightly better than the 1,628% we saw last time at least. Next up is Marvel Rivals. We tested it in the training range, lining the latency tester up to bounce between a dark pillar and the bright sky. With FPS uncapped, single GPU latency without frame gen was 17.9 milliseconds. The lowest latency LSFG entry was at 2x with the secondary 3060. That configuration posted an average of 29.7 milliseconds. LSFG's latency at 2x without the 3060 was 95% more than baseline at 35 milliseconds. While dual GPU had lower latency at 2x, at 4x it was the opposite by a wide margin. 4x with the 3060 averaged 50% more latency than the 5060 Ti just on its own. The 3060 couldn't keep up with the sheer number of fake frames required to quadruple over 200 real frames per second, and it only, so to speak, put out 546 FPS average. With the 60 FPS cap in place on Marvel Rivals, both the lowest and highest latency results hardly moved, those being no LSFG at 17.6 milliseconds and 20x LSFG at 121.1 milliseconds. However, the entire middle actually came down in latency compared to the uncapped tests. Our last game is Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2. Most of the other light sources had problematic levels of bloom for this one, so we used the light on the overhead crane for testing. The tech priests tell us the skull shape is imperative. The added latency induced by LSFG was significant, climbing to 39.9 milliseconds at 2x multiplier with the secondary 3060 and 48 milliseconds without it. Running 4x with the 3060 gave 45.7 milliseconds of latency, but with disproportionate 5% highs. The rest just scale from there, generally in line with the previous games. After throwing on the 60 FPS cap, the test gave us 35.2 milliseconds of total latency without any frame gen. 2x LSFG added 13.5 milliseconds on top of that, making for a 38.3% increase over the baseline. Running 4x frame gen, the dual GPU setup beat the solo 5060 Ti by 8.9 milliseconds. LSFG at 20x again proved its ridiculousness by way of 122.7 milliseconds average latency. What this boils down to is the choice between primarily a perceived visual smoothness improvement with frame generation and the actual felt responsiveness of the gameplay. And this, just as a reminder, frame generation, it can't repair a bad experience. So if you're at 30 FPS and you use frame gen to go to, say, 60, that's not actually 60 FPS. It doesn't feel like it in any way. The latency is definitely noticeable. And it doesn't look like it either. Now, it can help bridge the gap, and frame generation can help smooth things over. This is true of all the tools. But the biggest problem we had with NVIDIA and AMD primarily, but mostly NVIDIA really, is how they were just fucking lying, in NVIDIA's case, about like what you get with frame generation. A 5070 doesn't become a 4090. I don't care how much bullshit you put into the charts, it's not true. And that's kind of what we just want to caution, that frame generation, it has use cases. The cynicism towards it through most of this year comes from the GPU companies who debuted this stuff being assholes and using it to try and deceive people. That's the problem I have, all right? So what we liked with the LSFG is they're basically just like, it's $7, here you go, I don't know, do you like it? Okay, cool. They're not telling you it can turn a card at 40 FPS into a card at like 800 FPS. So we respect that. Anyway, point is, you can't fix frame rate from 30 and multiply it into 60 and actually feel like 60, but you can still smooth things over sometimes. The negative impact of latency from LSFG is significant. Mathematically, it's often huge, but experientially, it depends on how much latency increases and whether or not you can perceive the difference, especially in the game you're playing. How detectable latency change is depends highly on the type of game. So something like a turn-based grand strategy game feels totally different from a competitive FPS. It's also highly personal, meaning this is one of those situations where it's a lot harder for us to tell you what you would and wouldn't notice going from 0 frame gen to 2x. It's inarguable that LSFG objectively does degrade the latency aspect of performance, and probably if we look at all the others, they would too. It's just a question of which one does it more, and LSFG's added latency scales with higher multipliers. If using fake frames at all, we recommend against going higher than 2x if possible, maybe 3x to kind of keep the latency penalty somewhat in check. And this also applies to DLSS and FSR, although the amount of latency sort of delta will be different with those. It just depends what tool you're using. Latency impact isn't unique to LSFG though. They'll all have this. In addition to responsiveness though, there's also the consideration of how stale the frame data is that you're seeing when it's presented to you. So the amount of total end-to-end latency, or very close to it, is also basically the amount of time behind real time that the screen is running behind at least the actual internal logic state of the game. And so that's going to change the data that you're given to work with as a player. Even if you couldn't notice the difference between 10 milliseconds and 21 milliseconds in Siege, for example, for latency, you'd still be able to see and possibly react to information 11 milliseconds earlier if you left frame gen off. All else being equal, if two players fired headshots at each other at exactly the same time with exactly the same human factors, meaning their own responsiveness to input, and if this was predicated on what was shown on their screens, then the person with the lower latency will win that shot. On the other hand, increased visual smoothness of LSFG's frame gen may be desirable in single-player games when the added latency is below your personal threshold for being noticeable or annoying. Lossless Scaling's dual GPU mode is interesting. In 3 out of the 4 games without an FPS cap, the dual solution had lower latency than a single card. However, it was a wash when FPS was capped to 60. In other words, using a single GPU to run LSFG effectively frees up the main GPU's resources, which is the point. However, our testing in Cyberpunk showed the dual GPU approach at 2x and 4x to have worse frame pacing and consistency than the single card at all multipliers except for 20x. Now that's just one game, but the data in that example is clear. So that's it. Ultimately, it's up to you, of course, what aspects you value most. Objectively, latency does get worse with frame generation. That's not a new thing. It's been known for a while now. But for our part, we finally have some numbers for LSFG specifically, for latency specifically, and we have the separate piece on image quality and fake frame image quality. So with those 2 videos now, you put together a pretty full picture of how you might want to configure this thing if you even buy it, if it's worth buying for you or not. It might not be, depends on your situation, but you've got all the information now to take a look at it. And it's at least, we still think it's cool that they're doing this, and it's just kind of like a one-off developer rather than the world's most valuable company by market cap. So it's a nice change to see, but yeah, latency is still, of course, worse with FG on. Just how much worse depends. So that's it. Thanks for watching. As always, subscribe for more. If you want to support the type of work we do here directly for this type of independent benchmarking and comparison reviews, this is basically trying to fulfill a community request after we ran the image quality one last time. So there you go. You've got it now. Hopefully the data is useful, but if you want to help support us and fund our ability to do this type of thing, you can go to store.gamersnexus.net and grab something like our new retro IO themed coaster packs. I know someone emailed recently to say, Steve, it pains me that you call the floppy drives retro IO, and I know I'm so sorry. Look, I'm right there with you. So anyway, subscribe for more. Go to patreon.com/gamersnexus if you prefer. It helps out that way. We'll see you all next time.